Big Break Podcast, where we delve into the rich history of jazz to celebrate artists, entrepreneurs, and jazz enthusiasts alike. Join our host, Dr. Dina Bennett, well-known ethnomusicologist and executive director of the American Jazz Museum, on a journey into the stories behind the art. Let's go.
Welcome. I'm Dr. Dina Bennett, the executive director here at the American Jazz Museum in Kansas City. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the Big Break Podcast, where we dive deep into the world of jazz, culture, and community. Today, we have a special guest joining us, Glenn North, Director of Inclusive Learning and Creative Impact at the Kansas City Museum. Glenn brings a wealth of knowledge and insight into the intersection of jazz, diversity, and our vibrant community here in Kansas City. Join us as we explore these important topics and celebrate the rich heritage of jazz music. Let's get started. So can you start off telling me a little bit about your background?
So my background, I think I'll start with poetry. That's one of the things that I think people are really wanting to know when they ask me that. And it started with my grandmother, who on my 8th birthday gave me a copy of the poem If by Rudyard Kipling. And prior to that, my grandmother had always given me toys or clothes, gifts that I really got excited about. So for her to give me a poem, I was really underwhelmed by that.
Wow.
And she challenged me to memorize it. And so if, like the first stanza is, if you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs and blaming it on you, if you can trust yourself when all men doubt you, but make allowance for their doubting too. It goes on and on and on.
Mm-hmm.
And in this poem are all of these principles for what it means to be a good man or a good person. And so I memorized that poem, and I remember just how excited my grandmother was when I recited it back to her. And so I fell in love with poetry from that point on and started writing my own poems. I moved to D.C. back in 94 and lived there for almost 4 years and got really involved with the spoken word scene there. I'd never even heard the term spoken word before until I moved there. So then I moved back to Kansas City, and there's not much going on in terms of, performative poetry, venues where you can go hear poetry being, spoken word being performed. And so I'd been hearing a lot about the renovation of the 18th and Vine area.
So somewhere along the way, you fell in love with jazz and
well.
poetry and music,
Yeah,
or
sure,
somewhere
sure.
this is brewing. And
Well, I'll be
come
honest
back.
with you. I'd always loved music. But if we're talking about 97, when I came back, it was all about hip hop. Now, there was jazz influenced hip hop, but hip hop was the music that I was most drawn to, right?
Okay.
So I hear about the renovation or the revitalization of the 18th and Vine area. Really excited about that. I grew up in this neighborhood, and I wanted to find a venue where I could start hosting an open mic poetry reading. And so I decided on the Mardi Gras, which is at 19th and Vine, anticipating the opening of the Jazz Museum and the Negro League Baseball Museum and all of the restaurants and clubs and all of the things that were supposed to, open back in 97. So I started hosting that event in June of 97. The museums opened in September of 97. The first time I ever got paid to perform a poem was at the opening of the American Jazz Museum. I got paid $50 whole to perform a poem as part of the opening celebration. And so that began my relationship with the American Jazz Museum. I eventually got hired in the education department and then became also the poet in residence. And so I was here for 10 years, and I really feel that hosting Verbal Attack, the poetry series that I started at the Mardi Gras, and then coming to the Jazz Museum, were the things that really provided a great foundation for everything that's happened since then.
So tell me a little bit about your work here at the Jazz Museum. So I believe you worked in the education department, and you created one of the signature programs at that time for the museum, which was Jazz Poetry Jams. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Right. So I'll start off with my relationship with the Jazz Museum, other than when I first did that poem at the opening celebration.
Mm-hmm.
I got asked to host a series of workshops, or to facilitate is a better word, a series of workshops that would explore the relationship between jazz and poetry. At that point, I didn't know much about jazz music. I wasn't someone who listened to a lot of jazz music, so I had to do some research to be able to prepare those workshops. And they were primarily for students. The Jazz Museum has always had great education programs, and there are students who are learning how to play music that have all these opportunities. But Juanita Moore, who was the director at the time, was really interested in what kind of program could the Jazz Museum sponsor that would help young people who were not learning how to play music, have an interest in jazz. And so that's how those workshops came about. And they were really successful. And so born out of that idea was the idea for an ongoing poetry series called Jazz Poetry Jams, which was Adri Taylor's idea originally, who was one of the people that worked with here at the Jazz Museum at that time, a good friend. And so anyway, she came up with the idea but asked me to host it.
Okay.
And that became just incredibly popular. So what we would do is we have a house band, we had an open mic, and we'd always have a featured poet. But there was kind of this poetry slam, and we'd give away a cash prize at the end of the evening. And that program went on for 10 years, which is a pretty decent run for a series like that.
Definitely. And I know that the museum had its 25th anniversary in 2022.
Yeah.
But it wasn't until last spring that we could bring you back for a 25th anniversary edition of Jazz Poetry Jams.
Yeah. And that was very exciting. We were able to put together a lot of the folks who had been a part of making that program successful. So it was like a big family reunion, and I really enjoyed that, and everybody else did too.
Yeah, we enjoyed hosting it, and I think that if you're up to it, we should do more.
I would love that.
Yep, we should definitely have you back. So, what are some of the challenges and successes that you had working here at the American Jazz Museum?
Yeah, so one of the challenges, I think, is really how do you make jazz and how do you make history exciting for young people? So I think what I really enjoyed about Jazz Poetry Jams is that it led to us being able to sponsor youth poetry programs, one of which was called Louder Than a Bomb. And so we were able to work with over 25 different high schools in the greater Kansas City area who would come visit the Jazz Museum. They would write poems that were inspired by jazz. Not always, but oftentimes. But it was kind of a portal for them to learn more about jazz music. And then the Jazz Museum would sponsor a trip for whichever team won the local poetry competition to go to a national competition called Brave New Voices. And so that was one of the most transformative experiences I was able to be a part of in terms of my youth education and youth advocacy. But there was always a challenge for funding. That's always a huge issue. And so trying to keep that program afloat was not always easy. But yeah, just trying to figure out innovative ways to make jazz and this history relevant. We also did a program called From Bebop to Hip Hop. We did a slate of programs that helped young people understand that a lot of the hip hop music that they were listening to had jazz samples and jazz influences. And so we bring in jazz musicians and hip hop artists to not only do performances, but to do workshops with the young people as well.
That is so exciting. I think that is the challenge is the relevancy for young people, so that they don't come to the museum and they just think that, this all happened in the past.
Right. Right. And so, like I would talk about like a lot of the students who, come from the urban core and humble beginnings, hip hop was born out of this desire, right? These young people wanted to go into the clubs. This is when disco was popular. They didn't have the money to do that.
Right.
And so they'd have these parties in the park, and then DJs figured out how to scratch and mix and turn turntables into instrument. So that whole idea of improvisation is very much a part of hip hop. And then you tie that to, into the Civil War, going into, that period between the end of the Civil War and World War I. A lot of people who have been enslaved were finding instruments that had been discarded or lost.
From the Civil War.
Yeah, from the Civil War.
Yep.
And they were creating, they didn't have formal training. So they were figuring out all these new ways to play these instruments and not necessarily following
improvisation.
Eurocentric. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, we're going to make it up. We're going to find some instruments and make it up.
So kind of, making the most of what you have available to you, that spirit of improvisation is inherent in both jazz music and hip hop. And if you can make those connections, I think, young people start to perk up their ears a little bit.
Yep. So important. So, Tell me a little bit about what you are doing now with jazz and poetry. You've moved on from the Jazz Museum, and we're going to talk about what you're doing now, but tell me a little bit about what are some of the other things you've done, because you've done a lot in the community and in public spaces too with jazz and poetry.
Yeah, so I really am an advocate of poetry in public spaces. I'm a huge advocate of poetry performance. But, when I started working here, I had the opportunity to work with some of the best musicians in the country, and a lot of the best musicians in the country happen to live here in Kansas City. So jazz really started to become an influence. It really started to inform not only my work thematically, but in terms of cadence. And so a huge opportunity came when I was asked to do a program at the Nelson, which was this kind of experiment with ekphrastic poetry. And ekphrastic poetry is poetry that's written in response to a visual image. And so there's a painting at the Nelson that's a Black woman, and she's holding this baby. The woman is distraught. The baby's crying. Something bad has happened. And when you get closer and you read the label, you see that the title of the painting is Lynch Family. So this woman has just lost her husband to a lynching. And so I was trying to write a poem about this painting that I was going to use to facilitate this workshop, and nothing was coming. But there's this deep, rich blue background on the painting. And one day I was sitting there. I had written about 14 versions of the poem. I sat in front of that painting for hours. It just hit me. I was like, oh, this is a blues poem. And as you know, blues is a precursor to jazz music. But, I can share the poem. It's really short.
Yes, please.
The poem is called Lynch Family Blues. Went out swinging last night, baby. Hope you didn't wait up for me. Said I was swinging all night, baby. Did you stay up late for me? I wasn't swinging in no joint, darling. I was out on the limb of a tree. Now I'm walking on air, baby. It feels almost like I'm free. My feet steady kicking the wind. Yeah, I'm close to being free. And for the first time in my life, darling, white folks is looking up to me. Hear me, son. Your daddy loves you. Keep hanging on to hope. You the man of the house now. Gotta help your mama cope. Daddy won't be coming home no more. I reached the end of my rope. So that's the Lynch Family Blues. But I don't think I would have been able to write that poem had it not been for the work that I've been doing here, and music being so much a part of it, and jazz music and blues in particular. And so now if you visit the Nelson, that poem is right there next to the painting, permanently exhibited. So that's one of the places where you can find my poem on a wall throughout the city.
Outstanding.
Yeah.
So, that poem is so powerful, and it goes places that are deeply rooted in the African American experience.
Yeah.
And so it has really touched me during this moment that we're together here in this interview, and my experiences living in Mississippi in the Delta. And so thank you for sharing. And I hope that people will go to the Nelson.
Yeah.
And I hope that when they see that,
right,
they'll remember, the what you've given in terms of your creative expression.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Jazz and poetry both have deep cultural roots. So how do you see these art forms contributing to the cultural landscape? I mean, you're out there in public spaces now, museums. I think you were doing a project with Father Justin.
Yeah.
You want to talk a little bit about that?
Services.
Yeah.
So that's two different things.
Okay.
So definitely, I think music just has its own impact on the culture and the way that we see the world. And we know that a lot of these jazz musicians, the people who are celebrated here, like Charlie Parker and Charles Mingus and Max Roach, really had these ideas of social justice in their music. Charlie Parker talked about wanting to play a music that white folks couldn't play and couldn't co-opt. And Charles Mingus was drawing attention to, and even Louis Armstrong, to situations that were going on in Alabama with like the Little Rock Nine. And so music, especially in the Black community, has always been a source of inspiration and really kind of at the vanguard of the struggle. And I think poetry has been similarly positioned in the Black psyche that way. And the progenitor, the person, I stand on the shoulders of several people, but I just always have to shout out Langston Hughes, because I would argue that he is the father of jazz poetry, the progenitor of, he was the first poet to really intentionally use jazz music for inspiration, to use jazz music thematically. Because, in the early stages, jazz music wasn't given the respect that other genres of music were.
That's right. And that's been repeated throughout our history.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So for him to understand the cultural relevance of jazz music and to be such kind of
jazz and blues.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Just an ambassador for the music and using poetry as a way to elevate the music. I really look to him for inspiration all the time. But I also know that Langston Hughes was very much, like poetry can sometimes be this kind of academic thing. And people think you have to have some certain skill set to understand poetry. And so Langston Hughes was a poet of the people, right? And so I see myself as a community-based poet. So Reconciliation Services, which is on 31st and Troost, provides a lot of services for people in the urban core. But it started with this idea of feeding the people, and not necessarily in the way that happens in like a soup kitchen, but feeding people in a way where there's dignity and really good quality food and quality service. So Thelma's Kitchen was really the thing that kind of ignited this idea for Reconciliation Services, which now provides other resources for people such as, foster grandparenting and professional development in terms of helping people develop the skills that they'll need to find employment and things like that. So they provide all these services. And the building had fallen into disrepair, and in the renovation process, they thought it would be cool to have a public art project. And in those discussions, it was decided that public art project would be a poem. And so I was able to write a poem that is now displayed on the wall of the lobby when you first enter Reconciliation Services. My poem is on one of the first things you see when you walk in the door. And so with Truth being on 31st, with Reconciliation Services being on 31st and Truth, really quickly, we put together, it's a community-based art project. So let's bring the community together. So it's 31 people. We call the Truth 31. And we, went out on the corner of 31st and Truth and prayed and meditated and talked about like, what would this corner look like after revitalization? Because it's in a part of town that has struggled, right? And so a lot of the buildings in that area have fallen into disrepair. But what does it look like if we talk about this being a city of reconciliation is the idea for the project? And so these 31 people went through this workshop, and each one of them was asked to give me a word that they thought demonstrated what reconciliation is, or that is synonymous with reconciliation. Then with those 31 words, I had to write a poem. And so, that was not an easy task. But anyway, so that poem is now, as I said, in the lobby of Reconciliation Service.
Because I was going to ask you, what does the poem say? What does it reference? Which I figured it probably did focus on reconciliation, but it's so much more meaningful with the input from those 31 people.
So all of those people can kind of, like, their energy is in that
part
poem.
Of that. That's amazing. That is amazing. Wow. So what role do you think museums and cultural institutions play in preserving and promoting these type of art forms?
I think a huge one. I think currently, you talked about this time that we're in. There's a lot of racial unrest still, a lot of political unrest. And so the Alliance of American Museums, an organization I know that you're familiar with, a couple of years ago did an independent study. And it was determined that people have really lost trust in most institutions. People certainly don't trust the system of politics anymore. People don't trust religion anymore. People don't trust education anymore. You know, a lot of people feel like it's a racket, quite frankly. But
when it comes to those student loans, it certainly feels like it, right?
Exactly. But people still trust museums. I'm not saying we've always earned that trust.
Right.
But that is a public perception. And so that's a huge responsibility. You know, in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, there was this huge shift in the museum industry. You know, what does it mean to be a museum of the 21st century? Yes. And my thought is that it could be a place where we discuss really difficult issues. It could be a place where we talk about social justice. It can be a place where we look at history, as complicated as it is, warts and all, to help us better understand how we got to where we are and to figure out how we can project a better and a brighter future. I think museums have to take that responsibility seriously, that the public trusts them. You know, I work at the Kansas City Museum. All of our work is rooted in restorative practices. It's about building community. Restorative practices is about doing the work of repair when harm has been done. So, for instance, we work very closely, our curatorial department does anyway, with the Native American, the Native American Graves Repatriation and Protection Act. So all of the artifacts that we have in our exhibit, that the acronym for that organization is NAGPRA, or that law is NAGPRA. And so we're going through our collection to make sure everything that is in our collection that represents the Native American experience was obtained ethically. And if not, we want to go through the process of making sure those artifacts, those objects, that artwork is returned to the proper tribe. So there's a lot that museums can do, quite frankly.
There is a lot. And I think people see them as neutral ground, you know, in terms of when you're trying to maybe have the community come in and talk about some of those issues.
But I think it could be a safe space in a museum. I think it could be a brave space to kind of use some of the popular terminology. But museums are not neutral. I mean, they just aren't. I mean, if you look at the history of museums, more often than not, they're expressing a certain worldview. They can be neutral territory.
Yeah, I guess I meant a neutral space where,
absolutely.
You know, the events didn't happen here, you know, but you can come here and talk about it is what I mean. But that's a whole museum history background, and we know they've been, you know, slanted a certain way.
But I certainly understood what you meant in terms of like being a neutral space. Yeah. And I think that that's one of the things that we can do and provide that opportunity for people to come together and kind of hash out these really complicated things that we need to figure out.
Well, I think the other thing is in terms of curation, we can invite the community in to help us with different exhibitions.
Yeah. We do that at the Kansas City Museum. So I do see a lot of opportunities for there to be partnerships with the Kansas City Museum.
Curation.
And the American Jazz Museum. We have a neighborhood gallery. So we work with the Center for Neighborhoods. And when we do exhibits that highlight certain neighborhoods, the neighborhood folks in the neighborhood, they're the experts. They're the ones who tell us what stories they think are important, the people we should highlight. They are the ones who loan us whatever artifacts we exhibit, if they will entrust us with that. And so I think that that's a whole new paradigm shift for museums to allow someone else to have a say in what happens in that building.
Having our say. Yeah, because I was just reading in the museum periodical, which is, you know, the publication of AAM, Association of or Alliance of American Museums, on quote curation, especially in relation to those Native American museums. You know, there's a first American Museum, something like that in Oklahoma. And so, of course, the Native American population was able to come in and assist with that.
So with our, in our museum, we're attempting to tell the story of the history of Kansas City. From circa 1680 to the present. And so the first gallery, our galleries are organized thematically and chronologically. So the first one is called Cultural Confluences because, you know, Kansas City started on the confluence of the Kansas and Missouri rivers, who were named after those American Indian tribes respectively. But we work very closely with the Kansas City Indian Center and Haskell University, just to make sure that we're telling the story responsibly. We don't always get it right, but we're certainly open to the critique that's necessary to try to make sure we do the best that we can.
Well, tell me about your position there.
Yeah, so I am the director of inclusive learning and creative impact, which would be the director of education in most museums.
Okay.
But, I am the one who works very closely with, we work with the International Institute for Restorative Practices, IRP. I'm out of Pennsylvania. Their director of community engagement, Henry McClendon, is a great colleague. And so with his expertise and guidance, we are making sure that, all of our exhibits, all of our programs, all of our methodology is adhering to this idea of restorative practices. So I do our whole world, our whole story program, which is similar to a lecture series, but it's a lot more conversational and fun than just a typical lecture. I do our film series. I do all of the educational tours. We are really trying to move away from just your general field trip experience. General field trip to a field experience is the terminology we're using now.
Okay.
And we want to form relationships with schools rather than just the one-off where you come and visit. And wherever it's feasible, we try to do projects that incorporate real-world learning. So students can come in and understand more about what it means to be a museum professional and other professions that might align with what happens in a museum. We have what are called client-connected projects. So we work with schools that understand that process so that the students can help us with something that we actually use, a product that we actually use. So East High School helped us with a social media campaign. Shining Mission Northwest did a history of their school, but we documented the process of how they did the research and all of those things to be able to tell that story so that we can create a toolkit so that if other schools wanted to do some type of exhibit about the history of their school, they would have a template. We're really trying to rethink how we do things and how we can be more connected with the young people that we engage with.
Okay. Now, have you had the opportunity to do anything related to poetry at the Kansas City Museum?
Funny you would ask. Yeah. So thinking about restorative justice, thinking about restorative history, thinking about restorative practices, I figured why not restorative poetics? And so that really contextualizes the work I've been doing for the past 20 years. I'm working on the definition, but basically restorative poetics is poetry that speaks to social justice, poetry that speaks to how we deal with our individual or communal trauma, poetry that does the work of repair when harm has been done. Poetry can be a great source of healing.
Yep.
And so even poetry that kind of looks at our relationship with the environment, which some people refer to as eco-poetics. So I see all of that as being under the umbrella of restorative poetics. So to that end, we are doing a poetry series. It's called the Mbembe Milton Smith Poetry Series, which brings in poets who are using poetry as a vehicle to recover these historical narratives that have been overlooked. We are going to reinvigorate a youth poetry program. We're brainstorming ways that we might bring that back. But I wanted to launch it. I just wanted to introduce this idea to the world. And I thought back in February, that would be a great time to do it. It's Black History Month. And definitely, consider myself to be a descendant of the Harlem Renaissance and the Black Arts Movement. And a lot of the poets that wrote during that time were thinking about these ideas, right? So I started to get calls from, newspapers and things like that because they were looking for Black History Month stories. We had done a press release, and so we got a great response to that. The phone was ringing off the hook. People were making reservations to come to the event where I talked about the Restorative Poetics Initiative and all of the great programming we've been doing. And so February the 15th was the day of the launch. Well, as you know, February the 14th was the day that they had the Super Bowl parade and celebration.
Oh, yes.
And there was the shooting that took place. The unfortunate loss of life, right? So I'm just in shock, like the rest of the world.
Of course.
And So it hits me that morning when I woke up, like, oh, I still got this program tonight. And I decided not to cancel it. I got a couple of calls from news, reporters who said, we won't be able to make it. Obviously, they had other priorities. And I even got a few calls from people who had planned on coming to say, hey, I'm just, not in a good headspace, to come to the event, to let me know that. So that night, I say about 12 people showed up.
Okay.
And I just decided to share some poems that dealt with gun violence and it dealt with grief. And I was able to put into practice this theory that I had about the healing power of poetry. And at the end of the evening, it was just an opportunity for us to just be together and to have some kind of support for one another in this very dark moment in Kansas City's history. So I'm glad that I decided to go ahead with the program. And it just proved to me that poetry really can provide a space where people can heal. Now, don't get me wrong. It doesn't take the place of therapy, or if you're dealing with some type of PTSD or what have you, you need to get the help that you need. But poetry certainly does have this therapeutic quality in a way that you can kind of grapple with some of these, complicated emotions.
Yeah. Well, I expect that we'll see an article about that sooner or later.
I'm working on one now for
that would be
the Missouri
fabulous.
Humanities. But
Okay. And then I also want you to think about the Association of African American Museums. I'm on the board, and we'd love for you to submit a proposal for one of our conferences that we have every year to talk about that. I think a lot of museums would be interested in hearing more about that and maybe incorporating poetry programs or programming events, activities in there.
No, I love that.
Museums.
I love that idea. I hadn't even thought about that, but
we can talk about that.
Sure.
Tell me a little bit about, you talked about the Harlem Renaissance and some of those poets, Langston Hughes and all. So can you talk about influences and what an impact that kind of cultural event, if you will, has had on you?
So, like I said, I definitely see myself as standing on the shoulder, and I say that very humbly.
Yes.
Not trying to say I'm in league with them, but certainly have followed their lead. But I always start off with Langston Hughes. I really consider him to be one of my favorite poets, and I kind of model my career after his. But just briefly, the Harlem Renaissance, with all of the different creative expressions, of course, there was painting, jazz music was really starting to become a part of the fabric of American culture. But the poetry was really, the intention behind it was to show, and I would say all of the artists that were producing at that time, one of the things I will say that I think was important to many of them was to demonstrate that Black people were capable of producing high art. I'm capable of producing high art, then you have to see me as a human being. You got to remember, we're talking, 50 years within the, the end of slavery that the Harlem Renaissance is happening. So Black people are still...
It's still Jim Crow.
Yeah, exactly. So we're still trying to demonstrate to America and the rest of the world that we're worthy to be considered human beings. And so the Harlem Renaissance, that was part of that project, right?
Right.
So then the students of the Harlem Renaissance, people like Amiri Baraka, take it a step further with the Black Arts Movement. And they say, you know what? Let's not worry about what white folks think. Let's figure out what we consider to be art, and let's make our art revolutionary, because we're still fighting for equal rights. We're still fighting for our humanity. And so our art should reflect that, right? And so definitely a part of that project was revolutionary thought and progressive thought. And so for me, I'm interested in art and all of its manifestations, but I'm most interested in that intersection where art and activism meet. And so I feel like the Harlem Renaissance and the Black arts movement were great examples of that. And so I followed that example. So like County Cullen. Who else? Who else should I mention? I'm just trying to
Paul
think
Lawrence
of.
Dunbar.
Yeah, there we go.
Zora Neale Hurston.
Right.
Not
Lest I leave
necessarily a
somebody
poet, but
out.
yeah, all those luminaries.
Exactly.
Alan Locke.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I see, the Bible talks about a great cloud of witnesses. I always, in some way, am imagining them when I'm sitting down to write a poem.
Wow. What advice would you give individuals who are aspiring to work in cultural institutions, or even to be a poet in today's cultural climate and environment?
I would say, figure out ways to figure out how to find value in life outside of money. These are not necessarily lucrative careers. They can be. Don't get me wrong.
They're very fulfilling, personal fulfillment, of course.
But to be honest with you, I left one of the highest paying jobs that I'd had to move into the cultural institution space and to move into doing more work in the arts. And I don't regret that decision at all. But so far as like art is concerned, I would say whatever your discipline is, to be a student of the craft. So when it comes to poetry, I tell all my students to write good poetry, you have to read it. You have to really understand. If you're a musician, all of the you have to find those musicians who are creating the work that you desire to create and look at what they do. When you go to the Nelson, you see students from the Art Institute who are copying the masters. You have to do that, to develop your own voice.
And so you mentioned students. So I know you have a teaching background. And so can you talk about the classes you've taught?
Sure.
And because you're still in this vein of African American cultural history, activism, and you've done a lot of great things in the classroom.
Well, thank you for that. I really appreciate that. So I am an adjunct professor at Rockhurst, and I teach an AFAM Lit course. I've taught freshman and sophomore English as well, but I really enjoy teaching the AFAM Lit course. What's interesting is that the first year I taught it, Rockhurst is a predominantly white institution. And my thought was, and this class is an elective. So, and it's upper division. So I felt like this will probably be kind of an oasis for the Black students and students of color who are seeking some kind of cultural validation and those things. And that first day, I'm sitting in there, here comes a young white woman, and then another young white woman, and then another young white. So out of a class of 25, it was probably 20 young white women, like 2 young white men, one a young Black lady, and then 2 who were like biracial. Okay. Right? So talk about improvisation. Yes. How about improvisational pedagogy, right? So in that moment, I didn't change any of the material and so we're talking about the first year that I taught that was right in the wake of, that was like 21. And so we're still dealing with, the racial unrest of the murder of George Floyd. We're still dealing with COVID.
A lot of social unrest.
It was just a whole lot going on. And so I really, in my mind, I'm going to have 25 revolutionaries leaving up out of here at the end of the semester. But what happened was I realized the importance of cross-cultural dialogue. Not that I didn't understand it before, but I really understood it in that moment in terms of how do I share this material? The narrative life of Frederick Douglass, The Fire Next Time, James Baldwin, The Spook Who Sat by the Door by Sam Greenlee. Okay. A lot of these, Toni Morrison, Playing in the Dark. How do you teach this material to a class of primarily white students in a way that they can relate to and understand the significance of it? So I learned a lot, to say the least. But I really feel that it might not have been 25 revolutionaries who left at the end of the semester, but maybe 25 allies, So I think cross-cultural dialogue is important. But yeah, I love teaching. I love teaching literature, and I love teaching it in cool ways in their final assignment, rather than it being a term paper, is to do an episode of a podcast based on one of the texts that we read. So, just to make it more interesting.
Did you videotape those? And
we did not videotape them. They were recorded, but not videotaped. They were
recorded.
Yeah.
Okay.
These are, we don't have all of these resources.
Sure. Well, the name of our series is Big Break Podcast. And so we talk about what is a big break to someone and when do they think they had that? And some people say, oh, I've had more than one, or this is my big break. What is your big break? What do you consider something significant that really opened the door for you to pave the kind of career that you've had or the profession that you've been in to be so successful?
I think they're kind of connected. I think my first big break was when Alex Thomas, the owner of the Mardi Gras, said, yes, you can host your poetry reading in my bar.
Yes.
And you can charge $5 at the door, and we'll see what happens at the bar. And he couldn't imagine, at the time, that just seemed so foreign to him. Why would somebody come up in here and listen to poetry? And that first night, we had somewhere around 200 people. Wow. But in a small kind of a neighborhood bar for 200 people to show up to hear poetry, it just blew him away. And, he's been a mentor and a friend of mine ever since. So he gave me that opportunity. Because of that opportunity, I caught the attention of the American Jazz Museum. And when I interviewed for the position here, I remember, I tell the story all the time, Juanita Moore, who was the director, had told me after doing those poetry workshops that there was a position available in the education department if I was interested. And I said, sure. And in the interview, I was like, well, I've learned a little bit about jazz because I had to do these workshops, but I really listen to hip hop. And I was like, I majored in English. I didn't, major in museum studies and I just gave her a whole list of reasons why I would not be good for the job. And she, at the end of me saying all the stuff, she said, do you want the damn job or not? And I said, yes. And it was one of the best things that ever happened. It just provided such a great opportunity for me to learn more about jazz music and the history of Kansas City. It gave me a platform with hosting jazz poetry jams. It gave me an opportunity to work with young people in a very meaningful way that I think is a huge blessing. And I just was able to see the impact that those programs had on the lives of those young people. I run into them now. Some of them have kids, and you know what I mean? It's just amazing. So working here really kind of established my credibility as someone who could move into these other spaces and work with these other cultural institutions and build a career.
So speaking of credibility, you are known as the 18th and Vine Poet Laureate.
Yes.
When did that designation
So that was 2015. So Congressman Emmanuel Cleaver, who, was really the person who is largely responsible for the renovation of the 18th and Vine Historic Jazz District, along with JDRC, had seen the work that we were doing here at the Jazz Museum with the poetry and just thought that designation would kind of, as you said, kind of give me more legitimacy, or it was kind of a validating thing. So I really was grateful that he took the time and energy to do that. And not to give up too much of the tea, but there was a whole incredible slate of things that we had planned on doing had Hillary Clinton become president.
Okay.
But she didn't.
She did not.
And so that changed a lot of the things because ideally, we were going to have a youth poetry program that would allow students to go to DC and engage with the Congressional Black Caucus. It was a whole thing.
Okay.
But yeah, so but still that designation, it's opened a lot of doors. And now I think that's what led to the city of Kansas City now has an official poet laureate. But I think that that designation and people hearing that kind of made the city of Kansas City start thinking more seriously about the importance of having a poet that represents the city of Kansas City.
Oh, okay, because they didn't before.
They did not.
Okay.
Yeah.
Didn't know that. So where can our listeners learn more about the Kansas City Museum and how they can get involved there if they are interested in some of the things that you mentioned, like restorative justice, restorative poetics, or some of the things that you've talked about?
So to be honest with you, Kansas City Museum, right? On all the socials, it's Kansas City Museum. Our website is kansascitymuseum.org. The person who's responsible for keeping our website updated and all those things does a good job. And then I'm going to be doing some other things, hopefully here.
Yes.
with the American Jazz Museum and some other things with Bruce R. Watkins Cultural Heritage Center.
Okay.
So I worked there for a time and still have a relationship with the staff there. So I would say just keep your ears open.
Okay. I think so, because you're all about, and you're part of the African American Artist Collective as well, which can be found online.
So interestingly enough, I think that the African American Artist Collective, which is a collective of artists from all over the world now, but it started here in Kansas City, Congressman Cleaver, who was really thinking about like how do we move 18th and Vine forward, thought it would be helpful if he got input from African American artists. And so he had us gather at the Gates Barbecue on Main. And that was back in 2014. And so those of us who met, me, Sonny Ruffin, Gerald Dunn, who works here, Diallo, Giovanni French, who's a local filmmaker, Jason Piggy. We all sat down with Congressman Cleaver and really talked about ways that we could work more closely with him and the district to help things move forward. And out of that, we decided to start a collective because there are a lot of arts organizations in Kansas City who, at that time anyway, and it still happens, were not being, equitable in the distribution of money and resources that were made available to them. So we figured if we formed this collective and had this unified voice, that we would have better access to those resources. And it's been a fun ride. But yeah, I think if we talk about the genesis of the African American Artist Collective, we have to look at what was going on here at the American Jazz Museum as well.
Yeah. And I think I remember, I don't know if it was a second or third meeting that I attended that was at, I think, Black Archives. But I am a member as well.
Yes.
Proud member.
Yeah.
But what kinds of things should we look for in terms of if we want to get in touch with you? I know we'll keep our eyes and ears open, but are there any social media platforms that you'd like to share?
Yeah, so my Facebook account got hijacked recently.
So did mine.
And that's real talk. And it is hurt. It has been painful.
It's a hard thing.
But yeah, you would, and I'm Glenn North on all the socials. Yeah. So, and then I have a website that needs to be updated. But I mean, you can find out more about me. Yeah, just by Googling my name.
Well, we're proud that you have given so much to the American Jazz Museum and that you're still giving. And we look forward to the partnerships that we're going to forge. And onward and upward is all I can say.
Absolutely.
Congratulations on all the success. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Bennett. I really appreciated being here with you today.
Thank you for tuning in to an episode of the Big Break Podcast. Now be sure to like, review, and subscribe to the Big Break on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. We also want to thank Missouri Humanities. Their financial support helps us in connecting Missourians to the people, places, and ideas that shape society. So stay connected for more incredible conversations from the American Jazz Museum, because this is where jazz lives.